We are joined today by Stephen Wright, who is difficult for me to introduce in a short way to people who don't know him, because Stephen's been my mentor and very good friend for about 10 years now. So I'm just going to read out his biography because that's going to be the quickest way to do things. So Stephen Wright, formerly Joint Managing Director of Harold Holt and Founding Managing Director of IMG Artists Europe, amongst other things. He's enjoyed an illustrious career of, I think, about 50 years now. Is that right? Yeah. During which time he personally managed the careers of Semyon Bychkov, Sir John Eliot Gardiner, Mariss Jansons, Sir Neville Marriner, Seiji Ozawa, Yevgeny Svetlanov, and Yuri Temirkanov, amongst others. Stephen's also acted as an advisory consultant to such institutions as the Gulbenkian in Lisbon, the Oslo Philharmonic, St. Petersburg Philharmonic, and the Tonhalle Zürich. Internationally recognized for reassessing business models and developing new media avenues, Stephen set up the BBC Legends CD label and produced a number of television documentaries such as The Celebrated Art of Conducting, as well as filmed portraits of Ferenc Fricsay, Yevgeny Mravinsky and Arturo Toscanini.
The audiovisual CV has got founding 3 record labels and making 18 documentaries.
18 documentaries?
Yes, starting with the art
What were they?
Art of conducting, art of singing, art of piano, art of violin, film biographies of Toscanini, Fricsay, Sviatoslav Richter, music under Stalin, art of Chopin. I can't remember all of them.
I have no idea. I know that you're the voice of, is it the Mravinsky one? You're the voice of
I forgot about Mravinsky, yes, Mravinsky as well.
I knew that you'd made a lot of
films.
A lot of films. I didn't know it was 18.
It is 18.
You told me a really interesting story once about the Richter one, where he was like, there was a camera hidden in a plant pot or something for the interviews.
Richter refused for several years to be filmed in any way or a biography made of him to his closest friend Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean, well-known French documentary director. And eventually, Bruno decided on a very intelligent way. He wanted him. Richter had written a sort of autobiography in his own words. So Bruno persuaded him to read that out aloud to him one evening. And in the flower pot next to in the kitchen where he read this out, there was a camera. And so Richter read out all these very juicy, very interesting internal thoughts and so on. And then Bruno later, a couple of weeks later, showed him this film. And he said, "Oh, all right, you can use that."
Did he know about the...
No, not at the time. But when he was shown the film taken, he somewhat grumpily said, "No, all right, it's not so bad. You can use that." So Bruno built the film, which is an award-winning 2-hour documentary, on Richter in his own words. And that's the basis. So there are lots of shots in the film of Richter literally reading out in a slow, sad voice these things. But Bruno built. And I think he's going to make a biography of Carlos Kleiber, based on Kleiber's correspondence with all kinds of people throughout the world, because he wrote endless postcards, Kleiber. He refused to be interviewed.
Postcards?
Postcards, yes. He would send a postcard to Charlie Rogier at EMI or to Martin Engström and comment on all kinds of things. And there are hundreds of these.
That's
and
awesome.
They're witty and clever and fascinating, full of observations about music and artists. And I think Bruno's going to try and build the same sort of structure.
That's so cool. So what was your role in documentaries like that?
Well, various roles. Basically, I was fascinated by film archive of great artists of the past, because we're in an audiovisual world, and therefore just hearing their recordings was quite different to seeing Furtwängler or Toscanini or the others actually filmed in action. They look extraordinary. They are extraordinarily powerful personalities. You see Stokowski conducting, it's a sort of filmic magic that's quite different from just listening to the lustrous string of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so I became a film collector, basically. And I collected old film from everywhere, from archives everywhere, just for pleasure, amateur collector.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, there's a sort of underground. There's a tape underground and a film underground of private collectors who exchange amongst each other things, and people who know a lot about this. So I became an avid Toscanini collector, and so I got hooked up to the 10 leading Toscanini collectors in the world, and they had film and they had live recordings and so on. So from the age of about 16, I started collecting sound recordings. I have a huge, sitting in the garden in France, a huge cabin full of live concert performances recorded on tape from 1932 or 33 onwards, and film from about the same period onwards of Klemperer, Toscanini, all that stuff. And that made me think that it would be worth showing the younger generation who'd never seen these artists in action a film that sort of describes their careers and their performances using the best of the archive film as evidence, visual evidence, that these people were special. And if you look at The Art of Conducting, you will see the clips that we've shown. They are riveting. They're absolutely riveting. And it's a different generation. And these are the outsized personalities who were popular, really popular figures.
Yeah.
It's their time.
It's so different when you look at all those. I remember you made me watch Art of Conducting and Art of Piano, and it's so individual what you see on the screen. It seems to me that with recordings, everything's become much more standardized over the years, and I don't know how that sits with conducting orchestras in your view.
I think that's quite a complicated question, because I think what has happened is that with radio and television and recordings, people have been able to listen to each other in a way that wasn't the case really in the 20s and 30s. So the individual sounds of the orchestras, for instance, were based on what teaching was at those conservatoires at that time.
Right.
So in the 30s and 40s, 50s, you could often tell, if you had a good ear, that the sound of the woodwind was quite clearly the Czech Philharmonic. No other orchestra would have those sort of woody, reedy sounds, or that the first oboe of the Vienna Philharmonic had a typically kind of slightly acid sound to it, or that the strings of the NBC Symphony of Toscanini were the greatest virtuosos ever assembled in one place to play in an orchestra. And so the individual sounds of orchestras married up with the individuality of the conductors. If you listen to, the extreme obvious example is the difference between Furtwängler and Toscanini could add 15 minutes to the Beethoven Ninth. Furtwängler would be an hour and 15 minutes and Toscanini would be an hour. And they both had burningly sincere ways of viewing and interpreting the music that weren't fake. They came from the heart. So Furtwängler wrote about Toscanini's Beethoven Ninth and said he absolutely disagreed that the opening should be meticulous and clear, but it should be like something emerging from darkness and something vague and mysterious. So if you listen to the two passages, you hardly recognize the same music, but they both believed intensely. And I think it's difficult to say. Nowadays, there are all kinds of other virtues with pianists and instrumentalists, but what may not be the same is the sheer variety of interpretative breadth that exists. It has become a bit more standardized, yes.
You told me a great story, an anecdote once about Furtwängler. I want to say it would have been the Berlin Philharmonic, and someone was rehearsing. And
it's the timpanist. Werner Terschen says, there's a clip in Art of Conducting where he says, he was an extraordinary man because, for instance, he said, I would be not playing my timpani, I would be resting and with my head down, and I suddenly hear the Berlin Philharmonic change, the sound changes. And I looked around, the conductor was doing nothing extraordinary, he says, and then suddenly I look up and I see that Furtwängler has entered the hall, and by his mere presence the orchestra noticed, and suddenly they start playing in his style.
That's very
from
cool.
The mere presence of him just coming into the hall.
Do you feel over the years the change from conductor as sort of autocratic dictator to, I think what we see nowadays is much more kind of collaborative and such? Do you view that as a good thing artistically?
I don't really want to make a value judgment because, of course, it's a social change and behavioral change and collaborative change and partnership change is part of the social progress of how people interact with each other.
You mean just like society as a whole?
Like society as a whole. So in other words, if you look at the way Tony Pappano or Vladimir Yurovsky or Pavel Yarvi make music, it is or Simon Rattle, much more collaborative and feeling that we're all in this together, and therefore they all welcome contributions from the members of the orchestra. That's partly because members of the orchestra are much more musically educated than they used to be, whereas in the past, the conductor viewed the orchestra as his instrument,
right.
who are there to do his will and his command. And as a result, you hear orchestras playing in very individual styles. Mm-hmm. Mengelberg and the Concertgebouw is quite extraordinarily personal interpretations, but he was with them for, 48 years or something like that, so they played the way he viewed the music. Right. Nowadays, it is a more collaborative thing, and the members of the orchestra and some of the players in the orchestra are exceptional musicians who then become conductors. So, yes, I don't want to judge it. I think it's just we live in different times.
You managed the late Yuri Temirkanov. I remember you telling me a very interesting story about it involved a shed, and is it the Philharmonia or the RPO, and he stormed off and locked himself in a room or a shed or something.
Temirkanov was a sort of legendary conductor for the people who loved conducting and conductors, as I did at the time. But he had never travelled. He'd stayed in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And so I tried as a manager, fairly junior manager too at the time, to get the Russian State Concert Agency, Goskoncert, to let me have a couple of weeks of his time. Mm-hmm. And I was refused time and time again. No, he's not interested in travelling. He's much too important for his orchestra and all that sort of stuff. And so eventually I got a couple of weeks, and I got, in Maclay, I got some engagements with the Royal Philharmonic, a couple of festival halls, because everyone had heard of Yuri, that he was sort of legendary. And so he arrived. And my wife Yagna and I had literally just married, and her first job as a Pole was interpreting for a Russian conductor, which was not her greatest pleasure in life. But I mean, she'd arrived in October 77, and he played in October 77, right. Played 2 festival hall concerts. So the rehearsals were at Henry Wood Hall. She went along, and this is the first morning, and it was Prokofiev Classical Symphony, and he started with the last movement. And he conducted it at an incredible lick, incredibly fast. So the principal second violin put his hand up and said, "Excuse me, maestro, do we really have to play it at this speed?" And there was a silence. He turned white. He walked off the podium, went back to his room, and locked it from the inside. And my wife went along and banged on the door, banged on. Eventually she was let in. She said, "What's the matter, Yuri? What's the matter?" And he said, "How dare he talk to me like that? In Leningrad, I have musicians fired for crossing their legs. How dare he speak to me?" So she had to explain that this was democracy, that, orchestras had right. He said, "Democracy is all very well, but not in music." And so eventually she got through to him. He went back. They made up, and he stayed principal guest conductor for about 10 years. He loved the orchestra and so on. But it was a terrible shock to him to understand that musicians in England had views, expressed them, and it was more of a collaborative. In his case, it was, you played out of a large proportion of fear and respect for, Yuri's technique was absolutely fantastic. Right. He could do things, and the RPO noticed within 5 minutes that he could do something with his hands and his fingers and his eyes that most Western conductors have nothing like that conducting technique.
Yeah, I always love it when you talk about conductors, because you're like a kind of child at Christmas with awe about how they do things.
I learned all my music when I was at Westminster. I used to go to the festival hall about 3 times a week on average, and sat in the cheapest seats, which were always behind the orchestra.
The choir.
And watching how conductors did it and what effect they had was a salutary lesson to see technically how they got the effects they did, and how they controlled orchestras, and how they made music with orchestras and so on. So I learnt a lot there.
And you're not a musician yourself, are you?
I am not a musician. I play no instrument except the gramophone.
That's nice. No instrument except the gramophone. I like that. When it came to the autocratic leadership style of conductors like Temirkanov, was that an exclusively Russian school thing, or did you see that in other ways of making music around the world?
Again, a complicated. The thing is that a conductor has got to get 100 people, subscribing to a common view about how the music goes. So he has to cajole, persuade, lead, dominate, frighten, all these things. So you can say it's a much more collaborative exercise these days, which it is. But at the end of the day, the orchestra have got to respect what the conductor is doing. And to earn respect, at times you have to show authority, and you have to show a vision that you believe in very strongly. And if members of the orchestra don't agree with it, that's not actually on the cards in front of 100 people. They've all got to sign up to the view that's being expressed from the podium. It can be a shared view or it can not be a shared view. So, I mean, Marek Janowski said to me when he was the music director of a French orchestra, so a German in charge of a French orchestra, he said, you know, these musicians must play out of respect for me and a degree of fear. That was his view, a German in front of a French orchestra. And indeed, the Orchestra Philharmonic, there was some degree of fear because Marek could be quite scary.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's no one-fits-all recipe for this, but there is some degree of authority, or whatever you want to call it, autocracy, that can have beneficial effects because the musicians are in front of a personality whose charisma, whose power takes them over. I mean, I think one conductor I saw that was absolutely like that was Svetlanov, another Russian conductor who didn't speak English. Even after 40 years in England, he had an interpreter. But he did absolutely everything with his hands and his eyes, spoke very little, but he had an authority on the podium that all London musicians respected. All the orchestras thought very highly of him, simply because of a sort of physical control, presence and authority. And it wasn't malign or it wasn't unpleasant. They just knew that behind that there was a refusal to accept second best and a refusal to accept shoddy playing or indifference or what have you. So he sort of exerted a control of top possible achievement from every player. They played more than they played out of their skins for him, basically.
I always think it must be really difficult for guest conductors who walk in and have 4 days to, but what is it, like 10 minutes on the podium, isn't it, that decides whether it's going to be a success?
Well, that's a bit, yes, most professional orchestras can tell quite quickly whether they like or whether they respect a conductor, that's true. And some of them play tricks as well.
Play trick, or the orchestra?
Yes, the orchestra, just to test them.
Sounds like a nightmare job.
Well, yes, you've really got to want it and you've got to believe in yourself. That's one of the other things. You've got to believe in that what you feel and what you think of the music is worth conveying and worth extracting and so on.
So nowadays we have quite a few instances of very young conductors being the Jesus-type stars and leading the way in their 20s even. I think that's great, but also when you're working with an art form like this that's so big, the depth of knowledge and study and general learning that one has to do with these kind of great monumental artworks of humanity is why we, I think, respect the grand old maestro. Do you think that a young, I don't want to give any names, but a young conducting star can give us what that music deserves?
That's a loaded question because the answer is, of course, no.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, if you can't keep on harking back to the past because conditions are different, but if you imagine that some great conductor or other and many of them spent 10 years, 15 years learning their craft as a repetiteur in an opera house or as an assistant conductor with a second or third class orchestra, so that when they finally arrived, say 20 years after they began, with a first-class orchestra, there was a maturity and depth of experience to how to handle passages in music, how to get the best. So in other words, the training period was much longer, it was freer of distractions, it was out of the limelight. So obviously what emerged by the time they were 40 or what have you was different to what happens nowadays. And I'd say an example of someone nowadays who's done that, is Tony Pappano.
Right.
He spent a long time as a repetiteur, then in an opera house coaching singers and so on and so forth. So as a result, when he arrived at Covent Garden, this was someone exceptional who'd learnt an enormous amount and had the respect of all the singers and all the orchestra. And the result, when you listen, is that this is a finished musician, or on his way to being finished, and ready to conduct the great works with a fine orchestra and a wonderful chorus and all that sort of stuff. So, no, the answer to the question is you can't have young conductors aged 30 delivering what someone who's been through that sort of thing is at 60. You may get a lot of excitement and talent and whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, why is it that we're all obsessed with finding these youngsters now? And they're getting all the big jobs.
That's a wider question, which you have to ask about fame today and the speed at which people arrive and disappear and so on and so forth. And I think that's to do with media, social media. After all, there are certain pianists whom I heard when I was young who probably wouldn't make it today. They don't look right, and they've taken 40 years to make their first recordings and so on and so forth. So I think the concept of show what you're capable of gradually out of the limelight, so that when you emerge into your maturity, you are a fully finished artist, is a concept that is disappearing.
That's really sad.
Well, yes, I suppose it is, but you can't, you have to live with what you got. And I think if you look at, for instance, a child's ability at the age of 5, between say 5 and 10, to absorb and get thrilled by classical music is now amidst a whole variety of alternative forms of entertainment, speed of reaction, instantly available gratification. That means the idea if you're having to listen for 15 minutes to a piece of music as it develops is sort of ridiculous to a young person.
What do we do to change that? What's the secret to saving classical music?
Music education, basically.
Right.
Music education. If music education were given an importance, after all, when you think of museums and when you think of literature and when you think of visual arts and so on, just because they're 400 years old, they're not called elitist, are they? To go and look at a painting of Rubens or hear a play of Shakespeare's, people don't say, oh, that's elitism, because the theatre is flourishing and alive, and museums are happening. But classical music has suddenly developed some sort of label that says that it's elitist, it's only for the few. Well, it isn't. It's the most universal, non-spoken language that exists on God's earth. So why should it not be accorded the same place as the thriving museum business or thriving literature or what have you? But it seems somehow to have got into an area where it's attacked.
Yes.
And I don't quite know why, and it's not fair. It's not right either. Music at its best touches the most profound emotions in the human heart and soul. So how could you call that elitist? It actually is available to everyone on earth. And in its other forms is more appealing. If someone in Africa who doesn't read listens to sounds, musical sounds, they can be as moved as the sophisticated scholar reading a Shakespeare play in England.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it is about classical music.
It's a big question about the reason for music and all those sorts of things. But when you look at any other art form, I think has had some kind of benefit, might be the wrong word, but evolutionary benefit to humanity over the years. So like art, visual art. They have cave paintings to warn people that when the lions come, you're going to get eaten, so you don't stay there. And dance has had a social, marriages and deaths and whatever over the years, the centuries. People have danced and all kinds of things like that. There's no benefit evolutionarily to us developing and keeping music. And I think the earliest records of it, I think, are the 9th century that we passed music along. Like the development of musical memory can be seen from the year 800. Like, that's crazy. Why do we have it? Why have we kept it? Why have we developed it? And I was reading a lot recently about music and dementia. My father recently passed away from Alzheimer's, and I think it's amazing how at the end of life your brain can be switching off, but music is a thing, and it's like an inbuilt memory system that is not linked to day-to-day memories. It's like a core part of something human in us that can unlock people who've lost themselves, and you don't have to, in a dementia setting, you don't have to, it could be that you play some Elvis and you're transported back to some memories of Elvis, but you can play people classical music that they've never heard, and people will cry and they will respond like anybody would, even when everything else is gone. It can even, I think, relink and light up again those things in the brain that have switched off. It's a huge human thing, and I think it's devastating that we're all losing that to the idea that it's classist and elitist.
Well, I hope we won't lose it. I hope that this elitism argument will be defeated, because it's wrong. And if you also look at when certain pieces of music are associated with commercial enterprises, let's say Stanley Kubrick using the beginning of 2000 and using Also sprach Zarathustra in 2001, or the famous example of the Hovis ad when it was Dvorak 9 and so on and so forth, and you associate that, or the what is it, there's a duet the British Airways used to use, to Lakme or something like that.
Yes, the flower duet.
But if you do that, then suddenly millions of people not only associate classical music with agreeable sounds, but they also like the sounds. They like the noise it makes, and so on. So all I think it's about access and education. And you've got to, it's the Jesuits, the famous Jesuit thing is, I don't know what the exact saying is, but it's something like, give me a child of 5 and he is mine for life. And so if you get to children in the right way, between the ages of 5 and 8, before they get completely taken over by today's multimedia, and you instill in them somehow or other a love and a recognition of classical music, they'll keep it all their lives. But if you don't, then trying to sort of impose it or educate them as they grow up and then they choose all the alternatives available, that's much more difficult.
Yeah.
And I find that some of the music education attempts when you're 9, 10, 11, 12 are not going to work because they feel artificial. They don't, and it's sort of too late. What is this thing about museums? Why does visual art get more, old visual art get, exhibitions of Vermeer and what have you? People crowd and flock, and classical music is sort of dying. Why?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I mean,
you can better answer it.
Oh yeah. I guess you can walk in and look at the Mona Lisa for 3 hours or 3 minutes, and off you go again. That's consumable at your own pace. There's no cost barrier in the same way, right? You can walk into a museum and see what you want in it and then leave. You've got to pay to sit in a concert hall, in a seat, behaving in a certain way that you might not know how to behave, feel ashamed because you clap at the wrong point. You've enjoyed it and then, oh no, that was wrong.
So socially embarrassing.
I think it might, sadly I think it is.
And it requires effort. It requires concentration and effort.
It's hard. Concentrating for an hour is difficult.
Yes. And that's, in a way, that's the big problem nowadays. It's like international attention deficit disorder is the way of the world these days. So to ask anyone, that's why Classic FM is successful. That you get bite-sized pieces of music, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that's fine. But to listen to a Bruckner symphony on Classic FM, forget it.
I mean, I'm a musician and love the art form, but I will occasionally groan if the concert that I'm sitting through is a huge symphony in the second half. You've got to be in the right kind of place for it. So you've also had a huge career as a manager over the years, and if I can briefly summarize what I remember of it, we've got Ian Hunter in the very beginning. That was Harold Holt, where you rose to joint managing director. You then went over and defected to the creation of IMG Artists in Europe, where you were the leader of a lot of things. What were you?
I was managing director of IMG Artists Europe, which was 30 people to begin with, and when I left was about 95.
Which is huge.
Which is large, yes.
So can you tell me about that switch from Holt to IMG and the reason it was appealing?
Well, Holt was a wonderful company of basically artist management, great artists looked after very well by Ian Hunter and Dinah Ricks and Martin Campbell-White. But I come from a touring background, so I formed a theatre company, a Shakespeare company, to tour the States, and I was interested in touring, and I was interested in orchestras, and I was interested in conductors. So I came to the company as a junior employee with part-time secretary and 5 artists or something, and it grew. And then I started wanting to explore my own interest in the classical music field, orchestras, conductors, touring. I founded with Andrew Jameson an orchestral touring department at Holt, which started touring more and more orchestras, not only in the UK, but also around Europe. And then I also had an interest in the conductors, so I specialized in Eastern Europe, as it then was, so Russian and Polish conductors, particularly Russian. And they brought with them orchestras, the St. Petersburg Philharmonic, Mariss Jansons, so on, Celibidache, the Munich Philharmonic, and so on. So the orchestral touring department grew at Harold Holt to be quite a large department. And then I began also to be interested in the audiovisual side. So I think the first project I ever did was producing the 5 Beethoven concerti at the Festival Hall with Murray Pereira, the Academy, and Neville Marriner.
Right.
And so basically, to do that sort of thing, to expand in that way, you need investment. And you need to take a long-term view of the music and of the music business and so on. And Harold Holt did not have investment. It was a commission-based company which basically went from year to year. And so when IMG offered to purchase Harold Holt because it wanted a European base, I was in favor and the rest of the board were not. So I stayed for 18 months there, whilst the board tried to find another investor than IMG because they weren't keen on IMG, even though I was, and I agreed to stay because Holt had been very good to me. They'd given me 15 very good years, and I'd developed not only the company but myself and so on. And then it came to a clash, basically. Holt, IMG didn't want to wait any longer, Holt were not all in agreement, and I decided that for the future of what I wanted to do with my artists and so forth, IMG was a better place to be than Holt because of the investment side. And I think I was probably, not probably, I definitely was proven right in my own case, because when I went to IMG, the possibility of making the art of conducting, the possibility of European tours, the possibility of the Malaysian project, which was enormous, all of that was made possible by the structure and nature of IMG. So that's basically why I went for development and long-term expansion, if you want.
Can you tell me a little bit about Mark McCormack, original IMG big head, as a leader?
Well, the thing that made me feel that I'd be all right at IMG, and we were our little group of classical music, and because I was nothing without the team of people I built. I spent a long time at Harold Holt finding the right managers, and we all lived on one floor. So in other words, I had the team of people together and worked closely with them. I had some wonderful managers there. Basically, McCormack was a very powerful, famous business figure.
Right.
And he'd written several books like What Harvard Doesn't Teach You about business and so on and so forth. And yet he had purchased a small New York agency, very boutique, only about 6 people, run by Edna Landau and Charlie Hamlin. And they'd become IMG Artists.
And at this point he had IMG Sports,
Oh, yes, no, it was 32 divisions
events.
of international...
32 divisions?
Yes.
Oh, wow,
I
huge.
don't know, 70 offices. I mean, enormous. Okay. And... but he played golf with Yuri Temirkanov, and she said to him, why don't you do the same thing for music as you've done for sports management? And he thought, well, that's interesting. Why don't I start small? And he purchased Hamlin Landau.
Right.
And I happened to work with Charlie Hamlin and Edna Landau on, I think, Joshua Bell, Lynn Harrell. We had a number of common artists. They looked after my artists in America, and I looked after their artists in Europe.
Right.
And I saw that McCormack had treated, Edna and Charlie were personal managers. It was a very small company.
Right.
And I thought, well, if IMG houses them, treats them, supports them in this way, we'll be fine too. Because the fear in England was this vast American Leviathan would swallow up, for the purpose of making enormous profits, the tiny classical hand-tailored world. And I saw with Charlie and Edna that no, they'd been looked after, they'd been helped, supported, what have you. And that was the case when I went over to IMG. McCormack took a personal interest in the division. He was very tough about business. I learned a lot about cash flows and business plans and what have you, because that is how business is run. And at the end of the day, the classical music industry, our industry, is a business. You can't lose money, otherwise you go under. But McCormack, once he'd been through the rationale of what you wanted to do, the funds were always there. They had funds. And therefore they would invest in our division. We expanded. We acquired a vocal division with Tom Graham, then another one with Diana Mulligan, then Ray Armstrong, then...
Was this all your vision of...
Well, it was a sort of shared vision. IMG encouraged me to build, and I knew that there were people in other agencies who would benefit, whose career, the artists would benefit from IMG's view, where my artists had benefited too. So I was able to talk to Tom Graham, I was able to talk to Diana Mulligan. They had similar views on difficulties they had with smaller agencies and so on. So we built, I think we had 7 or 8 mergers and acquisitions. So we built the company. And then we had the Malaysian project, which allowed us to get into Asia, which was an extraordinary project. That was amazing. Building the Malaysian Philharmonic Orchestra from scratch and being the lead consultants to a new concert hall in Kuala Lumpur.
So
that doesn't come along more than once in a lifetime.
Hey, that's really cool. Was IMG Artists the biggest agency at that point? Like I forget how big Columbia was.
I don't really know, to be honest. I didn't sort of notice that.
How many members of staff?
No, I would have thought Columbia Artists was bigger. Ronald Wilford's group was bigger than we were. And ICM, David Foster was probably...
Is that Opus 3 now?
That's Opus 3 now. No, but actually, no, they were smaller. Now, I think IMG Artists worldwide, i.e. Charlie and Edna's office, there was one office in Italy, an office in France, and so on, that it built. No, I think probably it was the largest in Europe, actually.
And big agencies, I suppose, in those days meant power and influence. There seems to be a trend now towards boutiques. Was that the case pre-pandemic in your view, or is that a reaction to that nightmare?
Well, it's a difficult question, because I think that the style of management of artists in IMG was not dissimilar to the way it was at Harold Holt. In other words, let's say the artists, a couple of examples of artists taken over. So we took, let's say, Neville Marriner over, and we took Temirkanov over from Holt to IMG. All we did for both of them was to expand the opportunities for them to tour their orchestra, to make recordings, maybe to make films as well. But actually the quality of the diary management and the discussions about their careers, I don't think was all that different, because my managers came with me.
Right.
And therefore we were able to offer a broader panorama of opportunities.
Right.
But I don't think the style changed. I think people outside thought that I, as it were, sold out to the Americans, and I was in vast power and what have you. But I think after a number of years, key people like Clive Gillinson, who initially was very opposed to my going to IMG, after a number of years he realised that I hadn't really changed. I just got more possibilities and more opportunities, and you could be creative thinker in a different way when you were with IMG.
You mentioned just a bit ago about classical music being a business and can't lose money, blah, 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 blah. Do you feel it works that a business, I don't know if it's the entertainment industry business, the pop model, this business model that's been put onto classical music? To my mind, it doesn't really fit particularly well. Do you think that it can be improved, thrown away, start again?
I think there are a lot of people who buy agencies from outside this business and who think it can be improved. They come in saying, I know of certain examples who come in and say, this is terribly badly wrong. We can double the profits. We can do things much more efficiently. But the trouble is that you're dealing with individual clients, individual human beings, and you have to be very careful to ensure that they trust you and they know that you're in it as much for their own career. It's a business in the sense that if the Thatcherite, if you spend £10 and you earn 8, you go down. Therefore, you must get the equations right. And I think the problem there is illustrated in a way by COVID, that a commission-based business, especially where the commissions are low compared to other service business. In other words, a literary agent takes 25, 30, 35%, lecture agent 30%, and so on. The classical music business takes 20%. I think there's a case for saying that the commissions are too low, because it's very difficult to get the equation between excellent service, few clients, and enough money to pay for the staff to do that.
And it's so time laborious as well.
You could spend a whole day on a BBC engagement that may bring you £250 as you can on a phone call that brings you £1,000.
Yeah.
So there's no equation between time spent and money earned. And then you have to think about diversifying. You have to say, artist management is not inherently profitable. Therefore, you must do other things. You do concertos, projects, consultation, audiovisual, what have you. And then you're into broadening the church and getting more people in. So, I think
costs more money.
Costs more money. And therefore, I think the model of either very small or very big, it's the ones in the middle that are squeezed.
Right.
And there is some rationale that I once heard expressed by someone is, once you go over about 10 to 12 staff, you're into problems.
Right.
Because you can manage a team of 10 to 15 people quite easily. Managing a team of 20, 30, 40, 50, up to 90, it becomes something different. It becomes a bit more of a factory, and you have to leave the individual managers much more freedom if your personality allows you to do that. To get on with being their individual profit centers, but then you're running something different. So I think boutique or very large are the models that sort of can be made to work. And in the middle, there's expansion, there's diversification, problems, there's artists saying that, yes, you used to look after me, we used to talk every day, and now you don't, you talk only once a week, and you think, well, that's because I need more than you to make my living work or my expenses and so on. So the time factor and the service factor and the income factor are all a very complicated soup mix.
As an employer, or rather as a trainer of artist managers, you have, I think, started with, seen people start from the very beginnings to grow into some of them like leading agents of today. Who is someone or a couple of people who you've taken from kind of zero to who are running the business now, who are interesting, have got interesting leadership styles?
I think that's a very, very difficult question for me to answer, because some of the best managers I knew either left the business, didn't want to carry on, and or went into other things. I mean, for instance, at Harold Holt, Laura Rosenberg was an American girl who was absolutely superb at what she did. Roger Wright's wife, Rosie, was a manager there, and she was wonderful, but she left.
To do something else.
To do something completely different.
Right.
And so I think there were a lot of artist managers who basically had enough of it in some way or other and used it as something. But the skills required for an artist manager are so varied, they don't necessarily translate into the skills of being a leader.
Oh, that's interesting.
In other words, some of the some of the people who are best at artist managers are people who are best on their own, operating on their own, within a supportive structure. I mean, I say this because now I work in a different field as a consultant, and I see what the artist managers are like from the outside. Some of them don't respond very quickly to correspondence, some of them respond immediately, some of them think short-term but brilliantly, some of them think long-term. So, and also they've got to be this usual mixture of psychiatrist, nurse, business manager, musically very literate, sensitive to human foibles. it's a very strange trade.
Yes.
There's no university training for it.
Yeah.
And there are no courses that can teach you how to be an artist manager. There may be courses that say they can teach you arts administration, but managing an artist is a learn on the job.
It is a learn
and have
on the
the
job.
right qualities.
I worked with you for many, many years, and I thought you were the best possible boss that I could have had, in that you let me be free to fly, knowing that when I fell, inevitably you were always absolutely there to kind of catch and fix and these sorts of things. No, I don't know how, I'm not actually sure how you did it, but over the years I felt, without knowing that I was learning, I was part of a really intensive learning procedure with you that was, I think, not matchable anywhere else. It's been,
okay.
been
Well,
a pleasure.
I mean, the thing is, if you none of us are anyone without partnership and teamwork. It doesn't work. You can't do it all yourself. And therefore you either find a partner, teach a partner, or structure a firm with lots of partners in it. And so, at IMG, running the orchestral tours department, as it were, and running the artist management department were two completely different worlds. And every day I'd sit at the end of the corridor and I'd have visits by the artist management department and say, the orchestral touring department are not looking after artists, they're not treating them right, they're just products. And the touring department would come and say, these people seem to have no idea of what kind of pressures we have to sell dates to X, Y, and Z. That they've got to fit into the package. And so the cultures, the individual cultures in everything we do are different. It's a very specialized business. You wouldn't ask Andrew Jameson to be an artist manager. You wouldn't ask Jessica Ford to be an orchestral touring manager. I don't think they'd be good at it, either of them, and they wouldn't want to.
Right.
But as part of a structure that offers a service to an artist, you have to make sure that both families are happy.
I would be interested to know who you think the top 3 most influential or impactful leaders have been in the music business during your career, past or present.
I think that John Drummond, who ran the BBC and the Proms and the Edinburgh Festival, was the most Diaghilev-like creative figure I've come across in the music business.
What do you mean by that?
He was a Renaissance sort of arts head.
Right.
He knew about visual arts, he knew about dance, he knew about music, he knew about all kinds of things. And those were, he, as a personality, he was quite difficult because he was extremely opinionated and he rubbed up all kinds of people who hired him the wrong way. But the Edinburgh Festival, in terms of the creativity whilst he was there and the breadth, and the BBC and the Proms, and so on. He was quite remarkable. He was an impresario, if you want.
Right.
An impresario. And I think he was very influential and very admirable. I also think that Humphrey Burton, who was at the BBC, has written a remarkable book about what he achieved. And it's 500 pages of amazing projects that he achieved as a pioneer for television. He directed most of Bernstein's films, and he was a remarkable person in the business. I think what Clive Gillinson has done, first with the London Symphony Orchestra, because when he took it over, it was in absolutely dire straits.
Right.
And he made it financially solvent through artistic vision. He basically chose projects that were superbly aimed and which generated their own reward, income, and what have you. And what he's done at Carnegie Hall is remarkable. I admire him very much indeed.
What lessons in leadership have you learned from your artists over the years?
Well, there are 2 conductors who, as human beings and the way they've applied their art, have influenced me humanly. I think one of them is Mariss Jansons, because Mariss achieved the most wonderful collaborative results with musicians way before this was, when he took over the Oslo Philharmonic in the early 1980s. He transformed that orchestra through sheer idealism, goodwill, kindness, And he was an extraordinary person. He didn't really have to apply much authority. It just flowed naturally from him. And he never made a single enemy. I mean, everyone adored him, and everyone would support him because they knew that everything he did was in the interest of making the finest music possible in the finest condition. He was a lovely, lovely man. And somewhat similar, I think John Nelson, who's not a very well-known conductor, but profoundly religious, and therefore, as a result, has treated all projects, music as a sacred art, and people to work with as inherently good human beings, and therefore some of the less good human beings became good as a result of working with John, because they saw that that's what shone out of his soul.
Yeah.
And he's, and I admire him enormously. And also, I mean, the most fascinating conductor I ever worked with was Celibidache.
Right.
Because Celibidache had an absolutely unique way of viewing what music was. I couldn't pretend to understand all of it, and some of it may well have been, far-fetched.
Right.
But the results of his personal charisma and his belief and the way he conducted produced truly unique performances. No one else was like him. He understood acoustics better than anyone. He, for instance, in America on tour, he insisted on a 3-hour rehearsal, acoustic rehearsal, every single day for every single concert.
Right.
And he insisted that all the stage plans of all the American places he went to, he had to take with him the Munich Philharmonic risers, the staging.
All the way to America.
Always in America, which cost a fortune. But the reason he did it was that he believed that the acoustic of every single hall was different.
Right.
And therefore, unless he adapted the tempi, balances, and what have you to exactly the same structure of the orchestra on stage, he could not deliver his performance. And he turned out to be 100% right, because, I heard, whatever it was, there were 15 concerts, of which I think 10 of them had Bruckner 4 in them.
Right.
And the performances were extraordinary. And halls which had traditionally got dreadful sound, like the one in Toronto, the local manager there said after a 3-hour rehearsal with the risers in place and so on, he'd never heard any guest orchestra ever sound like this. And he knew exactly what he was doing, and he had this great different view of music, and on its own terms it was extraordinary. It worked.
I love how many stories you've got. Okay, can you give me an example of a leader who has inspired or continues to inspire you outside of the professional world?
Well, I'd say there were 2 people. One was my wife. She was exceptional and unusual and came from a different country and adapted to England and stayed Polish through it. And brought to my life a change in me, many changes in me, due to the fact that before I met her I was a typically repressed Englishman who found it difficult to express emotion and was not spontaneous and so on. And by the time she'd finished with me, I was an open river, and she believed that every problem in life had to be solved. Every sort of human or personal problem had to be solved by talking. And therefore, if you didn't, you should not hide anything at all. You should lay it out on the table and say, look, this is a problem for more, or this or this. And then you talk for 2 or 3 hours and you'd say, I've had enough. And she'd say, oh, we're just beginning, and that sort of thing. And what that did was to open up all kinds of, avenues and repressions, and also made for more comfortable relationships with people, because if you do talk openly about things, even though they may be initially, being English, embarrassed to talk about very personal things, the fact is that it did bring a kind of harmony in relationships and closeness of relationships that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah, that's nice. You said there was a second.
Well, the second is my GP, Dr. Martin Skur. I mean, he's been with me for 30 years. He's just returned to general practice. And he's the most wonderful doctor because he has a completely open mind to what might be the causes behind whatever it is I don't tend to go to a doctor for little things, but if there are large things, which there have been, he's got a kind of Jesuitical, magnetic, diagnostic skill. So he's a diagnostic genius. And so he sort of approaches problems from all kinds of angles, and gets gradually to the root of them by having the time to discuss things, the curiosity to find out, and a totally open mind. And I think that is remarkable quality in a doctor.
Yeah.
It's an odd thing to say.
And a professional.
My doctor, yes.
No, that's nice. 30 years with the same doctor.
Well, I had 30 years with him, and then he retired in 2009, so I went to another doctor, and he's just decided 13 years later that he wants to come back and be a GP, so I'm going back to him like an artist with an agency. I'm going back to him.
I'm assuming that's not the NHS.
No.
I think my NHS doctors, I've never seen the same person twice. It's a different world.
It is.
Okay, what do you know now that you wish you knew at the start of your professional journey?
I'm a consultant now, and in COVID, I got far more new work than I thought I would get. Because people thought, I think, we're in deep shit, or, we're in terrible trouble. So you've been around for 50 years, you must know, you must have a solution. And the answer is, I didn't, and I don't. But what I've learned now, although that's not an answer to your question, what I've learned is that I have a valuable quality of helping people avoid mistakes.
I would say that about you.
Because
yes.
I've been there before, and
Yeah.
I've made my own. So when someone says, this is a situation, my memory, I have a kind of memory that says, right, well, you shouldn't do that, and you shouldn't do that, and you need to take time for that. So there's a kind of master plan of avoiding mistakes that one has seen and made in the past. And that often leads to, a way forward that could have taken you years of horrors to
Yes.
avoid. And that's worth hurrying for, I think.
I know, we're not applying for a job right now. You
No, but...
already have one with me.
That's one.
That is something I would say about you, though. Wisdom.
Well, I don't know whether it's just the accumulation of experience, of memory. And I think the other thing is, the other answer to your question is nothing. I have nothing, because if I'd known all kinds of things that I know now, I wouldn't have done half the things I've done, because I went into them out of sort of creative impulse, like forming the theatre company. If I'd known what was going to happen about the Oxford and Cambridge Shakespeare Company, I would have never put one foot in front of the other, because in fact it was a series of near disasters which we worked through, overcame, and what have you. So I think ignorance is sometimes absolute bliss.
Yeah, that's a good life lesson. I'd go with that myself. Okay, and then last question. What's the best piece of advice that you'd give to others who are carving out their own careers in the music business today?
You have to want it with a burning desire. You have to... This must matter more than anything else in your life to want to go into this business. So you have to have a burning desire to do it and overcome obstacles and be a mixture of risk-averse and risk-not-averse. Take risks, don't take risks. It's like being a violinist.
Are you talking about just artists or off stage?
No, I'm talking about everything in life in a way.
Right.
If you want to go into this risky, difficult, not financially easy area, you must want it really, really, really badly. I remember that there was a person who came off the street to work for us.
A homeless person?
Not quite homeless, but just arrived in England, literally walked in off the street, and we gave her a part-time job. And she's now a manager. She wanted it so badly, and she made it work for herself through sheer determination and what have you.
I don't know who that is.
I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay.
But that was literally off the street person. So, and you have to be able to take risks and be careful at the same time. You just have to do that sort of thing.
Why? What kind of burning need to do it why does one want to do it?
Oh, because you love music and the music business and artists and the sound it makes and organisation and the kind of companionship that comes from the world you're inhabiting. And, you're bloody lucky to be there. You could well be an accountant, or you could be, a civil servant or what have you. And this, everyone who I talk to about what I've done in life says, God, you've been so lucky. And I thought, well, that's true, but it's taken a lot of highways and byways as well as being lucky.
Have you kept that same like childlike wonder that you had for it when you were at school?
Yeah, I don't have, at the moment I just feel I'd like to do new things and make them work.
Awesome. It's lovely. Thank you for talking to us today.